July 1943 arrived like the edge of a storm. For months the Allies had planned an assault that would strike not only at the German war machine but at its spirit. Hamburg stood as a jewel in the Reich's crown, a city of shipyards, steel, and smoke, vital to the German navy and to the pride of its people. It was also a city swollen with civilians, refugees, and foreign labourers forced into factories. The British remembered London burning during the Blitz. They remembered the cries in the night and the endless raids. Now they were ready to respond. Operation Gomorrah was born from that memory and from the belief that overwhelming fire could break Germany's will to fight. It was one of the most ambitious bombing plans of the war, combining British night raids with American daylight attacks to ensure that no hour would be safe for the city. On the evening of July 24th, hundreds of Royal Air Force bombers began to lift from airfields scattered across England. Mechanics wiped sweat and oil from their hands as the aircraft lined up under dim runway lights. Inside each bomber, young men barely in their 20s adjusted maps, oxygen masks, and bomb release switches. Their mission was to cross the North Sea, descend upon Hamburg, and deliver thousands of tons of explosives. It would be the first major test of a new technology called window, thin strips of aluminum dropped into the air to confuse enemy radar. German operators watching their screens would see nothing but a blinding storm of reflections. The bombers would be invisible ghosts drifting toward the target. As they crossed the sea, the hum of engines grew into a single, endless vibration. Pilots stared ahead through the dim blue glow of their instruments while gunners scanned the skies for fighters. The clouds thinned and the first outline of the German coast appeared. Below lay the sleeping city of Hamburg, unaware that its history was about to change forever. The first flares lit the sky, bright green signals marking the target area for those still approaching. Then came the sound, the deep thunder of the first explosions echoing across the water. One by one, the bombers opened their bays. The bombs fell in waves, bursting through rooftops and warehouses, scattering glass across the cobblestones. Firefighters and civilians rushed into the streets as air raid sirens screamed above the roar. In seconds the sky turned orange, a false dawn spreading across the city. The noise was unlike anything heard before. Explosions merged into a continuous roar that shook the ground. Children were pulled from their beds, families ran toward shelters, and somewhere above the clouds another formation of bombers arrived to release a second rain of destruction. By midnight, entire districts were ablaze. The old timber houses of Hamm and Borgfeld went up like matchsticks. Oil depots erupted, sending towers of flame into the sky that could be seen from more than 100 kilometers away. The smell of burning fuel mixed with the stench of charred wood and flesh. Pilots reported seeing the fires from their return routes across the North Sea, the glow so bright it illuminated their instruments. In the chaos below, rescue workers fought through collapsing buildings to reach the trapped, but the heat was already unbearable. Roads melted under their boots, and the wind from the fires was strong enough to pull doors from their hinges. Through the night, thousands of residents huddled in cellars believing the worst had passed. They did not yet know that this was only the beginning. The bombing had created conditions that no one fully understood. So many fires were burning that they began to merge, feeding on one another, drawing oxygen from miles around. The air above Hamburg began to spin, rising into a column of flame that reached the clouds. A new kind of storm was forming, one born not of nature but of human invention. When the bombers returned to England at dawn, the crews were silent. Some celebrated, others stared at the floor of the mess halls, unable to speak. They had followed orders, dropped their bombs, and returned alive, but something about the scale of the fire disturbed them. Reports came in that the entire city was glowing red, that the smoke had risen more than 20,000 feet. What no one yet knew was that the temperature on the ground had already begun to climb toward 800 degrees Celsius, and the wind inside the fire zones would soon reach hurricane force. The plan to cripple German industry had worked, but something else had been unleashed. Operation Gomorrah was intended as a message to Hitler's regime, a demonstration that Allied power could reach the heart of Germany itself. Yet as the sun rose over the smoldering ruins, that message was written not only for the enemy but for all of humanity. The war had entered a new phase, one where cities could be erased in a single night. The people of Hamburg, the pilots who flew above them, and the commanders who ordered the attack were all witnesses to the same revelation. The sky had become a weapon, and from that night onward, the world would never again see fire in the same way. Night descended over Hamburg with deceptive calm. For a brief moment, the sky seemed peaceful, painted with thin clouds reflecting the dim lights of a city already wounded by days of bombing. But above the North Sea, in the darkness, hundreds of Royal Air Force bombers were already in motion, engines vibrating through the night air. Their mission was not ordinary destruction. It was annihilation. The crews carried a deadly combination of high-explosive bombs to shatter rooftops and gas mains, followed by thousands of small incendiaries designed to ignite everything left standing. The target was not a single factory or harbor. It was the heart of the city itself, the crowded residential districts of Hammerbrook, Hamm, and Borgfeld, where workers lived in rows of wooden houses packed tightly together. When the first wave arrived just before midnight, Hamburg sirens began their mournful cry. Mothers pulled children from sleep, men grabbed buckets and blankets, and air raid wardens shouted from the streets for people to find shelter. Within minutes, the night sky bloomed into light. As the first bombs fell, the shockwaves rolled through the narrow streets, breaking windows, splintering doors, and exposing the timber frames of homes that had stood for generations. People ran through clouds of dust, clutching what they could carry, as the air thickened with smoke. The high explosives ruptured water mains, leaving firefighters helpless even before the flames began. Then came the second wave. The incendiaries, tens of thousands of small magnesium devices, rained down silently at first, striking rooftops and courtyards, bursting into dazzling white flame that burned hotter than steel. Sparks flew like stars. Within half an hour, dozens of separate fires began to merge, drawn together by their own heat. The temperature soared, and an invisible force began to move through the city, pulling wind into the growing inferno. Residents later described hearing a strange roaring sound, deep and unending, unlike the bombs. It was the sound of air itself being sucked into the blaze. Within an hour, winds exceeding 200 kilometers per hour tore through the streets, bending trees and pulling people off their feet. Flames leapt from house to house, carried by the wind, and entire rows of buildings vanished in a rolling wave of fire. The asphalt on the roads melted into black rivers. People trying to escape found their shoes glued to the ground or their clothes bursting into flames from the heat. The air became impossible to breathe, filled with ash and burning embers. It was no longer a bombing raid. It was a single, enormous fire feeding on itself, a living storm of flame that devoured everything in its path. Inside the shelters, terror gave way to silence as people realized the danger had changed. They were not suffocating from fear but from the loss of oxygen. Doors glowed red as metal handles turned too hot to touch. Mothers pressed wet towels to their children's faces, but the air was already poisoned. Some prayed, some screamed, others sat still, waiting for it to end. In the streets above, firefighters fought an impossible battle. Pumps ran dry, and hoses burned in their hands. The fire moved faster than any human could. Even the canals that ran through the city boiled from the heat. A few survivors later said that they saw whirlwinds of flame spinning through intersections, pulling carts, trees, and even people into their core. The sound was deafening, a mixture of thunder, screams, and collapsing walls. By 2 in the morning, Hamburg was a single burning plain. Roof tiles exploded, iron beams bent like wax, and the glow from the flames could be seen from the Danish coast. Pilots returning to base described the city as a sea of fire stretching to the horizon. For those on the ground, the light was blinding, the air thick with soot, and the heat unbearable. Even in cellars buried deep below the streets, the temperature climbed to lethal levels. Thousands suffocated without ever seeing the flames. Those who tried to flee into open squares found themselves caught in swirling winds that tore the air from their lungs. Children vanished in seconds. Families holding hands were pulled apart by invisible force. By dawn, the wind began to ease, but the damage was done. Hamburg's working-class districts no longer existed. They had been erased in a single night, reduced to blackened earth and silent ruins. More than 35,000 people had died in the space of a few hours, most of them civilians who had never touched a weapon. The survivors stumbled through the rubble, dazed, their faces covered in soot and tears, searching for water, for air, for anyone left alive. The smell of burned flesh hung over the city like a second sky. Operation Gomorrah had achieved what no bomb alone could accomplish. It had summoned nature itself as a weapon, a storm made of fire, wind, and human suffering. The night of July 27th to 28th became known as the night the air caught flame, a night when war reached its most terrifying form, and a city of nearly 2 million souls learned what it meant to stand beneath the fury of the world's first firestorm. Beneath the burning streets of Hamburg, tens of thousands of men, women, and children crowded into cellars and basements, believing that concrete and earth would shield them from the fury above. The sirens had sounded so often that many had learned to wait, to hide, to pray, trusting the same walls that had saved them before. Families carried blankets, food, and buckets of water, sealing heavy iron doors as the bombs began to fall. At first there was confidence, even routine. The ground shook violently, plaster fell from ceilings, but the people whispered to each other that they would survive as they always had. They could not imagine what was happening above their heads. The fires that now consumed entire neighborhoods were no longer separate flames, but one colossal blaze feeding on every breath of air. Within an hour, the oxygen that sustained the hidden world below began to vanish, drawn upward by the storm. Inside the shelters, the change came quietly at first. Candles flickered and died, the air grew thick and hot, and people began to cough. Children cried for water as the walls radiated unbearable heat. The pressure in the rooms rose, and the metal doors glowed faintly red. Some tried to open them for air, but the moment they did, a rush of smoke poured inside. The firestorm above had created winds so powerful that they turned the stairways into chimneys. Those who dared to climb out were met by a wall of fire that devoured skin and cloth in seconds. Trapped below, others pressed rags to their faces, desperate to find a pocket of breathable air. Mothers held their babies tightly against their chests as husbands poured the last of their water onto the floor in a futile attempt to cool it. It hissed and evaporated instantly. The smell of burning would mixed with human sweat and panic. Then the lights went out completely. Somewhere above, the roar of the firestorm grew louder, a continuous thunder that shook the ground. The people underground could hear the city dying through the walls. Explosions echoed like the heartbeat of the inferno, and the air grew thinner with each passing minute. Voices turned to whispers, then to silence. One survivor, years later, said that the last thing she heard before losing consciousness was her father praying in the dark. No one screamed anymore because there was no air left to scream. When the oxygen was gone, the fires consumed it all. Carbon monoxide filled every corner, invisible and merciless. People fell where they sat, arms wrapped around loved ones. Many died without a sound, their faces calm, as if sleep had come to spare them the terror. When the storm finally ended and dawn rose over the ruins, rescue workers moved through streets of ash searching for survivors. The ground was still hot enough to blister skin, and the air reeked of smoke and death. They opened the heavy cellar doors one by one, expecting to find the injured. Instead, they found stillness. In some shelters, entire families sat upright, untouched by flame yet lifeless. In others, the walls were blackened with soot, and the floors were covered in a fine layer of ash where human forms had once been. The heat had been so intense that bodies turned to dust. In one cellar under Borgfeld, more than 300 people were found seated as if attending a silent congregation, their faces serene, their hands still joined. The rescuers could not even separate them at first. The heat had fused their bodies together. Among the dead were not only German civilians but also foreign laborers from Poland, Russia, and France, men and women forced into the city's factories who had no access to shelters. Many of them lived in makeshift barracks near the docks, the first areas to ignite. They perished where they worked, burned alive or suffocated before help could reach them. Even prisoners from nearby camps were caught in the inferno, their guards fleeing long before the flames arrived. The firestorm made no distinction between soldier and child, between oppressor and victim. It swallowed all equally. In the following days, the survivors who emerged from the cellars were haunted by what they saw. The streets they remembered had vanished, replaced by a desert of rubble and twisted steel. Smoke rose in endless columns, and every gust of wind carried the stench of death. Rescue teams moved through the wreckage in silence, carrying bodies on stretchers made of broken doors. They had no coffins, no names, only numbers. The dead were buried in mass graves on the city's outskirts, marked with wooden stakes and the faint hope that someone might return to identify them one day. The people of Hamburg understood that what had happened was more than destruction. It was suffocation on a scale the world had never known. The fire had not just burned their homes, it had stolen the air from their lungs. In those basements and tunnels, safety had turned into death itself, and the shelters built to protect them had become tombs. By the time the last bodies were recovered, the city had become a monument to the power of fire and the fragility of breath, a reminder that in war, even the air can turn against the living. When dawn finally broke over Hamburg on July 28th, the city that had once pulsed with the rhythm of industry and trade lay in silent ruin. The sun rose through a haze so thick it turned the light to blood red. Ash drifted through the air like snow, settling over what remained of streets, bridges, and churches. The air was suffocating, heavy with soot and the stench of burned wood, fuel, and human flesh. What hours earlier had been a metropolis of 2 million people was now a lifeless expanse of blackened stone and twisted steel. The firestorm had devoured everything in its path, leaving behind a landscape that seemed more like the surface of another planet than the heart of Europe. The asphalt of the main roads had melted into pools of dark tar that trapped shoes and wheels alike. Iron girders bent under the heat as though made of wax, curling into grotesque shapes. The skeletons of buildings stood like monuments to despair, their facades hollowed out, windows melted, and stairways ending in open sky. Whole districts that had once been vibrant with families, markets, and laughter were erased. Hammerbrook, Ham, Borgfeld, and parts of the Altstadt were reduced to smouldering ruins, indistinguishable from one another. More than 250,000 homes were destroyed, and entire blocks had vanished without a trace of their former architecture. The city's proud skyline of spires and warehouses was gone, replaced by pillars of smoke that rose miles high into the atmosphere. The firefighters who survived the night staggered through the ruins, their hoses burned to ash, their uniforms black with soot. They could do nothing. The fires were too vast, too hot to approach. Even water from the canals turned to steam before it could reach the flames. The Elbe River, once the artery of the city's prosperity, was choked with debris and bodies. Barges drifted aimlessly, carrying the dead who had sought refuge in the water and never resurfaced. Streets that had been wide boulevards were now trenches filled with rubble, and every breath stung like acid. Those who emerged from cellars or shelters blinked in disbelief. Their city was gone, replaced by an endless wasteland of smoking craters and collapsed masonry. In the center of this devastation, the human cost became visible. Bodies lay everywhere on tram tracks, in open squares, on the steps of churches, and in what had once been gardens. Many were unrecognizable, their forms reduced to grey ash or fused into the pavement by the heat. Others remained eerily intact, preserved by the lack of oxygen. Rescue workers moved from street to street, marking locations with chalk where they found entire families seated together, untouched by flame but lifeless. Eyewitnesses later spoke of a storm that seemed to consume people as if they were made of paper, a fire so powerful that it pulled human beings into its core and left nothing but shadows on the walls. The survivors who wandered through the city that morning were half mad with thirst and shock. Their faces were blackened, their hair singed, their eyes empty. Many had lost everything: their homes, their families, their neighbors, and moved through the ruins as ghosts, searching for water or a familiar voice. Some dug through the rubble with bare hands, hoping to find loved ones still breathing. Others simply sat in silence, staring at the smoke that rose endlessly toward the heavens. Aid could not reach them. Roads were impassable, telephones and electricity destroyed, hospitals reduced to rubble. Those who had medical knowledge worked with scraps and rags, tending to burns with dirty water, their efforts swallowed by the enormity of suffering around them. By afternoon, the city that had once been called the gateway to the world had become a sealed tomb. The wind carried the bitter smell of death for miles beyond the city limits, and refugees fleeing the disaster spread word of the horror they had witnessed. In the countryside, villagers looked toward the horizon and saw the sky still glowing orange long after the sun had risen. For them, it was as if Hamburg itself was still burning, its soul unwilling to rest. From the air, reconnaissance pilots described a city without streets, without order, a single sheet of ash stretching from the river to the fields beyond. As days passed, the fires slowly weakened, leaving behind an eerie quiet broken only by the crackle of collapsing walls. The rain that finally came turned the ash to mud, covering the remains of streets and filling the air with steam. Underneath that grey film lay tens of thousands of bodies. They would not all be found. The cleanup crews worked in silence, burying the dead in mass graves, their shovels clinking against metal and bone. Each corpse was a reminder that civilization itself had been tested and found fragile. Hamburg was no longer a city but a warning carved into the earth. The people who survived that night would never forget the sight of their home turned to dust. The port that once hummed with engines and cranes was now still, the water black and lifeless. The sound of hammers and bells that had defined the city's rhythm was replaced by silence. The storm of fire had eaten everything stone, steel, and soul. What remained was a place stripped of identity, a charcoal graveyard under wounded sky, where the only movement was the wind scattering ashes of what had once been life. When the last embers faded and the smoke began to lift, Hamburg revealed a landscape that defied comprehension. The firestorm had left the city in ruins, but even worse was the silence that followed. Days passed before anyone could measure the scale of what had happened. What had once been Germany's proudest port had become a cemetery without boundaries. The numbers would later be written down, studied, and debated, but for those who walked through the ruins in the weeks that followed, no statistic could capture what their eyes had seen. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Streets that once teemed with life had become fields of ash. The few who survived carried the memory of screams and heat that could melt glass, of winds that tore the air from their lungs. When rescue teams finally entered the city, they did not find the wounded, they found the dead. By November 1943, German authorities estimated the number of victims at around 31,600, but even they admitted the count was incomplete. Later research and eyewitness accounts pushed the figure closer to 40,000. Many had simply vanished, reduced to ash or buried beneath the rubble. Another 125,000 were injured, their bodies burned, lungs scorched by smoke, and minds fractured by terror. Hospitals overflowed, their corridors lined with people wrapped in bandages, silent from exhaustion and pain. For the doctors and nurses who remained, the task was endless. They had no supplies, no electricity, and no hope of saving everyone. Each patient they lost became another number in a growing tally that could never tell the full story. More than 1 million inhabitants fled the ruins, transforming the surrounding countryside into a sea of refugees. They walked for miles, barefoot and dazed, pushing carts and carrying bundles of charred belongings. Their faces were grey with ash, their eyes blank with disbelief. Villages around Hamburg overflowed with the displaced, and farms opened their barns to strangers. Children wandered alone, separated from their families in the chaos. Some were taken in by local families, others disappeared along the roads, never seen again. The once proud gateway to the world had emptied itself into the fields of northern Germany, scattering its people like ashes in the wind. Half of the dead were women, and 1 in 8 was a child. These figures reveal not only the brutality of the bombing but also its nature. It was not soldiers who perished in the firestorm, but ordinary citizens. Housewives, dock workers, teachers, and their families. In the shelters and cellars where they sought safety, entire generations were erased. For the survivors, the loss went beyond family. It was the death of neighborhoods, of shared memory, of identity. Streets where people had known every face were now blank expanses of dust. The social fabric of Hamburg, built over centuries, was gone in a single night. The process of recovering the dead was almost as horrifying as the fire itself. Rescue workers, many of them soldiers or prisoners forced into service, wore gas masks to withstand the unbearable stench of decay. They dug through rubble that still smoked, pulling out what remained of men, women, and children. In some areas, the heat had been so intense that bodies had melted together or turned to ash, leaving only faint outlines on the ground. Identification was nearly impossible. The authorities recorded names where they could, but most were listed simply as unknown. Mass graves were dug outside the city limits, vast trenches where thousands were laid side by side. Wooden markers stood at their heads, later replaced by simple stone memorials. Families who came to search for loved ones found nothing but silence and dust. In official reports, the death toll was reduced to figures neatly typed on paper, but behind every number was a story that would never be told. The woman who died clutching her newborn, the factory worker who returned to search for his mother and never came back, the old man who refused to leave his house because he had survived the First World War and believed he could endure this one too. Each death carried its own tragedy, but together they formed a single truth. Hamburg had suffered the most catastrophic civilian loss of life in the history of modern Europe up to that point. Outside Germany, the news spread slowly, censored by wartime propaganda. Allied officials spoke of a military victory, of a successful blow against Nazi industry. Yet among the airmen who had dropped the bombs, few celebrated. Some reported sleepless nights, haunted by the sight of the firestorm rising into the clouds. They had seen from above what the people below could not, the vast red glow of a city burning alive. In letters home, a few wrote that it looked like the end of the world. By the end of the year, Hamburg no longer smelled of smoke, but the memory lingered in every corner. Survivors rebuilt what they could, living among the ruins with the ghosts of those they had lost. The official numbers remained uncertain, shifting between reports and studies, but the truth was beyond arithmetic. The city had not simply lost 40,000 people. It had lost its voice, its rhythm, its soul. The toll of the firestorm was not only in the count of the dead, but in the silence that followed, a silence that still seems to echo through history, reminding humanity how swiftly progress can turn into ashes when fire becomes the language of war. In the aftermath of Hamburg's destruction, the world stood at a crossroads between triumph and horror. Operation Gomorrah was celebrated in Allied headquarters as a decisive blow against Germany's war machine. Reports spoke of crippled shipyards, annihilated oil plants, and shattered transportation networks. For the strategists in London and Washington, it was evidence that the relentless bombing campaign could break the backbone of the Reich and hasten the end of the war. But beneath the language of victory, another truth emerged, one that made even the architects of the operation uneasy. The firestorm that consumed Hamburg had not simply destroyed industry, it had consumed the lives of tens of thousands of civilians. For the first time in history, a city had been deliberately transformed into a weapon against itself. The moral line between military necessity and mass slaughter had blurred beyond recognition. The British policy of area bombing, developed under the command of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, was born from frustration. Precision attacks on factories and railways had proven ineffective against the Nazi war economy. The new doctrine argued that destroying the morale of the German population would cripple production faster than striking any single target. Cities became legitimate objectives, their destruction justified by the belief that it would save Allied lives and shorten the conflict. Hamburg was the first full expression of that theory, the test case of what total war could achieve. The results were both staggering and terrifying. From a military standpoint, it worked. Industrial output fell sharply in the following months, transportation collapsed, and the German government was forced to divert thousands of men to rebuilding efforts. Yet the images from the ground told another story, one of charred children, asphyxiated families, and a city turned to dust. As the news filtered back to Britain, reactions were mixed. Many civilians, still remembering the Blitz, felt a grim satisfaction that the enemy had finally tasted the same suffering. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines, praising the devastation of Hamburg. Yet in private, leaders were unsettled. Winston Churchill himself, who had authorized the mission, later expressed doubt. He wrote in a secret memo that the continued destruction of German cities might no longer be a means of shortening the war but an act of sheer terror. Others in his government echoed that sentiment. Clergymen questioned whether moral victory could survive such tactics. Scientists who had designed the technology that enabled the bombing began to wonder whether they had unleashed something beyond human control. The ethical debate extended far beyond Britain. In the United States, where daylight raids targeted industrial zones, some officers argued that the deliberate incineration of cities violated the very principles the Allies claimed to defend. But the war's momentum left little room for conscience. Every success on the battlefield seemed to demand escalation. If Hamburg could be destroyed in a single week, then other cities could follow. Dresden, Cologne, Kassel all would soon learn what it meant to be part of a strategy that turned fire into policy. The psychological warfare that had begun as retaliation for the Blitz had evolved into something far greater, the mechanization of annihilation. For the Germans who survived, the firestorm was more than defeat, it was revelation. Many began to question their government's promise of invincibility. The propaganda that had once portrayed Germany as unbreakable could no longer hide the truth. Even hardened soldiers returning from the front were shaken by the sight of their homeland reduced to ash. The moral consequences reached both sides of the conflict. In destroying Hamburg, the Allies had demonstrated their power, but they had also shown the world how easily humanity could rationalize horror in the name of justice. Historians still argue about whether Operation Gomorrah was justified. Some maintain that it was a necessary step toward victory, a blow that weakened Hitler's war effort and saved countless Allied lives. Others see it as a turning point, the moment when the war for liberation began to resemble the very tyranny it sought to destroy. What cannot be disputed is that Hamburg changed the nature of warfare forever. It marked the beginning of a new era where technology and morality collided, and where the distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved in smoke. The legacy of Hamburg reached far beyond 1943. The same principles of saturation bombing would later be applied with even greater precision and horror in Tokyo, Dresden, and finally in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The firestorm over Hamburg was both a triumph of engineering and a failure of the human spirit. It revealed that progress could serve destruction as easily as creation, that victory could carry the taste of ash. In the years that followed, military planners studied the event not with remorse but with fascination, turning it into a blueprint for future wars. Yet the survivors remembered it differently. For them, the firestorm was not strategy, it was damnation. In the quiet decades after the war, scholars and soldiers alike continued to wrestle with the question born in the ruins of Hamburg. Was it worth it? Could the liberation of Europe justify the slaughter of its innocents? The answers remained uncertain, suspended between necessity and guilt. Hamburg had proven that humanity possessed the power to destroy on a scale once thought divine. It had also shown that such power, once used, could never be fully contained. The fire that consumed the city left behind more than ruins. It left a shadow over the conscience of civilization, a reminder that even in a just war, victory can burn as fiercely as the fire it unleashes. When the fire finally died and the smoke thinned above the ruins, Hamburg no longer resembled a city but a memory of one. The air was heavy with dust and silence. Whole districts had disappeared from the map, leaving only mounds of blackened rubble stretching to the horizon. The port that once pulsed with the rhythm of ships and cranes stood lifeless, its waters thick with oil and debris. Factories were shells, bridges lay broken across the Elbe, and the proud avenues of commerce were replaced by narrow paths carved through ash. Food was almost impossible to find, and clean water was rarer still. Disease spread quickly among those who remained. The summer heat turned corpses into a breeding ground for flies. Those who survived the fire now faced hunger, thirst, and despair. Yet within that ruin, something unbreakable began to stir. The survivors, many of them women, the elderly, and orphan children, returned to what was left of their homes. They carried buckets, shovels, and faith that seemed irrational in the face of so much devastation. Brick by brick, they began to clear the rubble. Some searched for valuables, others for memories, a photograph, a wedding ring, a piece of furniture untouched by fire. Every object recovered was a small act of defiance against annihilation. Entire families who had lost everything built makeshift shelters out of debris. They lived without windows or doors, wrapping themselves in blankets at night, listening to the wind howl through what had once been walls. In the mornings, they gathered in silence and began again, moving stones from one pile to another, carving life out of ruin. The Allied authorities who entered the city were astonished by the scale of destruction. Photographs taken in the following months show endless plains of rubble with only the spires of a few churches still standing. Yet even among this devastation, people began to rebuild with quiet determination. Relief stations distributed soup, clothing, and medicine when they could. International organizations and neighboring towns sent aid, though not nearly enough to feed the million displaced. Still, the will to survive persisted. Women who had lost husbands and sons formed teams to repair walls and roofs. Children carried water from the river, their faces still blackened with soot. In one corner of the ruined St. Nikolai Church, a small group of volunteers lit candles each night, saying prayers for the dead. They did not know how many had perished, only that the city itself had become their grave. Through the autumn of 1943, Hamburg began to take on the shape of a wounded survivor. Slowly, trams resumed service, their tracks twisting around collapsed buildings. Markets reopened on street corners, selling bread baked in portable ovens. The people learned to live with the constant smell of smoke and decay. The sounds of hammers and shovels replaced the sound of bombers and sirens. It was not triumph that drove them, but necessity. Every brick lifted was an act of remembrance. In some places, survivors planted flowers in the bomb craters, marking them as graves for those who had never been found. Roses bloomed where entire families had suffocated. The living could not afford to build monuments, so they built gardens instead. As the war dragged on, new bombs fell on the city, but nothing could match the devastation of Operation Gomorrah. When the fighting finally ended in 1945, Hamburg was a skeleton, its population reduced and its soul exhausted. Yet from the ashes rose a collective will to rebuild not only walls but conscience. The people rebuilt their homes over the very basements where families had died, sealing the memory beneath the foundations of their new lives. The ruins of St. Nikolai were left standing as a warning, its blackened tower rising above the city like a monument to human destruction. The government debated whether to preserve the ruins or erase them entirely. In the end, they decided to leave some standing, reminders of what war had done. In the post-war years, Hamburg's transformation became a symbol of Germany's slow return to life. The port reopened, ships once again crossed the Elbe, and factories resumed production. But beneath the surface of economic recovery lingered a silence deeper than any wound. The city had rebuilt its body, but its soul remained scarred. Memorials began to appear quietly, not in celebration but in mourning. A plaque on a wall, a bronze figure in a courtyard, a church bell forged from melted steel, each one whispered a story that words could not tell. These were not monuments to victory, they were monuments to guilt and remembrance. In the decades that followed, the people of Hamburg taught themselves to live with two truths: that they were victims of war, and that they had been part of a nation that unleashed it. Schools taught the history of the Firestorm not as a tale of suffering alone, but as a warning of what blind obedience and hatred could create. Every July, citizens gathered at the ruins of St. Nikolai to light candles for the dead. The bells rang through the rebuilt streets, their sound carrying both sorrow and endurance. Hamburg had risen again, but it had done so with humility, aware that its foundations rested on ash. The city that once symbolized destruction had become a place of reflection, where resilience was measured not by how much had been rebuilt, but by how deeply the lessons of fire had been remembered. 80 years have passed since the night Hamburg burned, yet the memory of the firestorm still lingers like a shadow cast across modern Europe. Beneath the city's smooth streets and glass towers, the soil holds remnants of that inferno: charred bricks, shattered porcelain, and the bones of those who never escaped. Construction crews still uncover unexploded bombs buried deep in the ground, silent reminders of the night when fire ruled the air. Every July, as twilight falls over the Elbe River, thousands gather to release candles onto the water. The flames drift across the dark current, glowing softly as they move past the skyline that rose from the ashes. For a moment, the modern hum of traffic fades, and the city remembers. The survivors who once walked through fields of rubble are now few, their voices fading into history, yet their stories remain carved into Hamburg's identity. They speak of a night when the world seemed to end and of mornings when the smell of smoke still clung to the air. Their memories are not only of loss but of resilience. They rebuilt their homes brick by brick, choosing to live above the graves of their families rather than abandon the city to silence. Their courage became the foundation of modern Hamburg, a city that rebuilt itself without erasing its past. The ruins of St. Nikolai Church stand untouched at the center of the metropolis, their blackened stones reaching toward the sky like a monument to both destruction and endurance. Historians view the firestorm as a turning point in human warfare. It was the moment when technology and morality collided in full force. Before Hamburg, bombing had been seen as a military tactic. After Hamburg, it became a psychological weapon. The raid proved that modern war could erase a city overnight, and the lesson spread quickly. In 1945, the same principles were applied to Tokyo, Dresden, and finally to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each time, the justification was the same: the destruction of cities would shorten the war and save lives. Yet with each inferno, the boundary between victory and atrocity grew thinner. Hamburg became the first warning of what would happen when humanity learned to burn its enemies faster than it could mourn them. The city itself has turned remembrance into duty. Memorial plaques line the walls of reconstructed neighborhoods, marking where schools, hospitals, and homes once stood. Museums display melted household items, watches stopped at the moment the firestorm struck, and letters never delivered. These are not symbols of pride but of reflection. The people of Hamburg do not commemorate the event as a triumph but as a lesson in humility. They know that civilization can be reduced to ash not only by hatred but also by indifference. Every generation is taught what the fire meant not only to Germany but to all mankind. Yet even as Hamburg thrives, the echoes of that night persist. On hot summer days, when the wind carries a dry scent of smoke from distant forests, older residents say the air feels familiar. They remember how heat once breathed through the streets like a living creature. The city's rebuilt walls are strong, but they rest upon fragile ground, the literal ashes of the firestorm. Beneath the concrete and glass lies the memory of what happens when progress becomes destruction, when science serves vengeance instead of reason. The lesson is clear and enduring. Fire may win a war, but it can never build peace. Internationally, historians continue to debate the ethics of the bombing. Some see Hamburg as a grim necessity that helped end the war sooner. Others regard it as a crime that opened the door to future horrors. Both perspectives agree on one point: the firestorm changed everything. It stripped warfare of its illusions of honor. No longer could nations pretend that civilians were protected by distance or moral restraint. The night Hamburg burned, the age of total war truly began. Its glow illuminated not only the ruins of one city but the path that led to atomic fire 2 years later. Today, Hamburg stands tall again, its harbor alive with ships and cranes, its skyline a symbol of renewal. Yet it carries within it the conscience of a civilization that once set itself ablaze. The memory of the firestorm is not confined to history books or museums. It breathes through the city's rhythm, reminding every generation of the fragility of peace. Each July, when the candles float down the Elbe, their reflections shimmer like the souls of those who perished, whispering the same truth to all who watch. Destruction is easy, rebuilding takes lifetimes, and forgetting is the greatest danger of all. Hamburg's story endures not because it was destroyed, but because it chose to remember, and through remembrance, it continues to teach the world what it means to rise from fire without losing its humanity.